The president wants to spy on 200 million Americans without a warrant. Has he read this document, which he was sworn to uphold?
Now, I will not have you libel Abraham Lincoln.
I don't understand the problem with registering guns. We register cars.
Mark Levine brings you the news the government doesn't want you to know.
Today, an explosive story about connections between white supremacists and Islamic terrorists.
When there's a conflict between Scalia's conservative values and the Constitution of the United States, he throws away the Constitution.
When we do have secret prisons, that is not what America's all about.
Let's go to Mark in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, America. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. Welcome to a special year-end edition. Happy New Year to everyone watching the show. I want to talk tonight about labor unions, specifically about, well, the income inequality in this country. Unemployment is going down. It's down to 7%, still historically quite high. A lot of people leaving the labor force. And let's face it, wages aren't going anywhere up. There are protests all across the land, particularly from fast food workers who are making very low wages. There's questions about whether the minimum wage should be higher. And there's the overall question of whether unions are still performing the function they used to. I plan to ask some tough questions to my guests tonight. Let me introduce from my far left, David Broder, the president of Local 512 of the Service Employees Industrial Union. Did I get that right?
Close enough.
SEIU. Correct me. International Union.
There you
International Union. I apologize. And Virginia Diamond. She's a general counsel of the Virginia AFL-CIO and a special assistant to the United Auto Workers as well. So if anyone knows anything about unions, it's you folks. So I want to start, before we get all to the issues of today, I want to start with a historical perspective, because I think some people don't realize, like, why we have weekends, or why we get paid time and a half if you work more than 40 hours, or why it is that if your arm gets chopped off in the factory, you actually get compensated for it. And I remind people who haven't studied their history that more than 100 years ago, that happened all the time in factories across the nation before the rise of unions. So before we talk about the difficulties of today, which I think you probably would both agree are real, let's talk about just a little bit of historical background about the rise of unions. Tell us some of the things that unions have done and in the past, and then we'll get to today. So Virginia, Ginny, why don't I start with you?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Historically, the problem of income inequality in the United States was huge. There was vast poverty and extreme wealth. Workers worked long hours in dangerous conditions. They had no time off. They had no vacations. They had no health and safety, pensions, health care, etc. And what changed all that was the rise of organized labor. In the 1930s and 1940s, the unions were formed, the AFL and the CIO.
American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization.
Outstanding.
Did I get that right?
Very good.
Okay, because I messed up the SEIU. I want to make sure I get these acronyms right.
You
live in a land of acronyms.
You did great. So what happened during that time with great inequality and poverty and health and safety problems was that organized labor came together. They had a seat at the table. They had a voice on the job. And what that led to was the creation of the American middle class. Which
really didn't exist. I mean, if you look at Depression era, for example, and you see, the Okies, or you read The Grapes of Wrath, or you see just the horrible pictures when you had 25-30% unemployment, and you had a few very rich people in the 1920s. They're the ones, I guess, doing the Charleston and celebrating in the Hamptons, but there were vast swaths of poor people. And then by the 50s, already you see a solid middle class that I think increased into the 60s and 70s. So let me just go back, if I can, to the 30s. What was it that allowed for the rise of unions, and do we still have those elements today? David?
I think it was a matter of conditions just getting so bad, and that something had to give. And as you say, people assume that we've always had the American middle class. They think of it as just a permanent fixture of our country, and that wasn't the case.
They haven't talked to their great-grandparents.
They have not. And so whether I think about the history of this country or the history of my family, it's really the labor movement that got my family into the American middle class. It was my grandparents who were state employees, union members, that allowed my father to go to college. It was my mother, being a union teacher, that made sure that our family had health insurance. And so it's really, it was a story of things getting so bad that working people stood up and said, we need to have a different kind of economy. And I think sadly, we're getting dangerously close to having that moment again.
And we're going to get to that in a second. In terms of the past, I think the big union, the first big union president, I guess, would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There were some things that were done in the teens and all, but the Wagner Act, I guess, was the one that allowed labor unions to form and set up the National Labor Relations Board and some things that still exist today. How's that working today? I mean, it worked in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Is it working as well today?
Unfortunately, it's not. The National Labor Relations Act really hasn't been updated for over 75 years. The problem is that when workers do try to form unions, employers can threaten to fire them. They can fire them.
That would be retaliation. Why isn't that illegal under the
Well,
Act?
the problem is that there are no penalties. So
it's illegal, but no one punishes.
There's no punishment, there's no disincentive. And so what many employers do, not all, is when workers try to organize a union, they frighten them, intimidate them, and imply that the company is going to close, they'll lose their jobs. So people really have to have an incredible amount of courage just to exercise a fundamental right to be part of a union.
And David, unions were on the rise, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I don't know when the cap was, the 60s or the 70s perhaps, but they've been on the decline since then. Why specifically? Why is union membership so low now compared to, say, the 1970s?
There are a number of factors, but what we're seeing is the end result of a decades-long attack on working people that's really about conservative politicians and big businesses partnering together to...
Didn't big businesses always hate unions? I mean, back in those Pullman strikes, they used to beat up workers. How did they get more power the last 30 years than they had from the 30s to the 50s?
I'd say in the post-war era, there was an understanding among businesses that when labor and management partnered together, you could have a lot more economic prosperity. And what we've seen is this current rise of large corporations that no longer honor that pact between labor and management.
That's right. There was a social compact where corporations saw a responsibility not only to maximizing shareholder value in the short term, but also they had a responsibility to their communities, to their employees.
Used to be you worked 40 years in the factory, you retired, you got a nice pension and health care, and maybe even a pocket watch. I mean, and people had the same jobs for all these decades, probably in my grandfather's era as well. But that has changed, and I'm trying to figure out what caused it, because when we talk about what we need to do in the future, I think it helps to understand the past. How do we get here, is my question.
As David said, what happened was there was vast changes that took place starting in the late 70s, 1980s, where corporations made a decision, and it's connected to globalization, but corporations started to outsource to find cheaper labor. So whereas, for example, I used to work with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, there were garment factories here where people made a decent salary, maybe just a few dollars over minimum wage.
I think my grandmother worked in one of those factories.
Okay, right. But now those factories were all moved over to places like Bangladesh. Now in Bangladesh, the hourly wage is less than 25 cents an hour. And those people work in very dangerous conditions. Back in April, 1,100 garment workers were killed there. So there was an outsourcing of our manufacturing base to a large degree to countries that paid far, far lower wages.
Let's talk about outsourcing, globalization, because I think with the rise of maybe easier transportation, it used to be, in Bangladesh, they might work for 10 cents a day, but it would cost you hundreds of dollars to bring the goods here. Now it's cheaper to do that, and so companies can undercut their own union labor with these outsourced workers. Why couldn't we simply tax products from Bangladesh so that it ends up being basically the same as costing American workers, and then they could hire American workers and they'd be a better deal? I mean, that's certainly possible, theoretically, isn't it, David?
I don't think there's the political will in this country, unfortunately, to stand up to some of those larger corporations. It is absolutely possible that we can make sure that the jobs we have here in America are good jobs, the kind of jobs you said where you go, you work your whole life, you get a good pension, you're able to invest your paycheck back into the community. So it's absolutely possible. We just need to have that collective will.
Jenny, one of the things that President Obama promised to do, of course, understanding he doesn't have full control over Congress, I know President Obama understands that, but he promised that one of the ways he would fight outsourcing was actually to punish companies. I remember he said this in his re-election campaign, that to punish companies that take jobs overseas and reward those that bring jobs here. I don't see that happening. Now, I don't know if you can tell me what Obama's plan was and why it didn't get fulfilled.
Well, rather than address the politics, the national politics of it, I'd like to just follow up on that with some comments about where unions are trying to address that issue.
Okay.
And that is that.
I mean, it hasn't happened. There hasn't been. There's no real punishment for companies that
that's
take jobs
exactly right.
overseas.
Corporations still have free reign, and there are still very unhelpful trade deals that are trade agreements that have. That really benefit corporations but not workers. So what's happened, we were talking about the 1980s and 90s and subsequently what happened was that corporations followed up that globalization with an intent to eliminate unions, if possible, from the United States as well, deunionization, and that's when the sophisticated anti-union approach to organizing came in. So people here who wanted to unionize were threatened and harassed.
How does that work? Because there is a vote, right? And it's now I know that there's ways you can sign off cards and give it to your union members in some places. In other places, there's a vote. How does the corporation know who voted for whom?
Unfortunately, what we've seen is the rise of an anti-union consultant class. Lawyers and others who big companies hire and who teach them essentially how to break the union, how to bust that union drive.
You go after the union leaders, I suppose?
You intimidate them, you harass them, you hold captive meetings, and ultimately you fire them. And as Ginny was saying earlier—
What's a captive meeting?
So imagine that your boss sits you down, closes the door, and starts talking to you about how the union is bad and how you want to keep your job and how you shouldn't join the union. People naturally are going to be afraid, and they're going to do whatever they can in that fear to keep providing for their families. And those are the kinds of tactics that these anti-union consultants teach companies how to employ. They're clearly illegal, but as Ginny was saying, there's no penalty.
Yes, and mandatory captive audiences meetings where everyone's called together. It's not just individual retaliation. It's an announcement. Like, for example, Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of Nissan, came in by closed circuit television and told everyone before a union vote there that he really didn't think that his company could be competitive in the United States if there were unions there. So that's essentially implying to people,
even though GM has unions, United Auto Workers has unions, if there's one industry that's pretty well unionized, it's the auto industry.
Well, what's interesting too is that Nissan itself is unionized everywhere else in the world, in Japan, in Spain, in Brazil, in South Africa, in England, in Australia, but yet here in the United States it's not union. And when the workers in Mississippi have been trying very hard to organize a union there, they had these mandatory captive audience meetings where they said, they implied very clearly that they didn't think that they could sustain a company in the United States if Americans had those same rights as workers all over the world with Nissan.
I want to take a break. When we come back, I want to know what can be done legally to fix this, to make it easier for people to unionize, and also to understand a little bit more about the way unions work. Because I know some people complain about their union dues. What exactly your union dues go to? If you want to call in and join the conversation, you can. Just pick up the phone and dial 571-749-1166. We'll be back after this.
Osama bin Laden calls getting nuclear weapons a religious duty.
Today, materials that can be used to make nuclear weapons are stored in more than 40 countries.
Sometimes protected by just a chain-link fence.
Yet not enough is being done to lock down these materials
before terrorists steal them.
Why did we learn all this?
My mother,
my son,
my sister-in-law
were all murdered September 11th.
Help protect America.
Together we can.
Please join us.
The stem cell issue is being debated throughout the country. Truth is, most everyone has an opinion, even if they don't know the facts.
Let's stop arguing and start really understanding the potential of stem cell research.
For us and for millions of Americans living with disabilities, get the facts.
Call 1-877-842-3442 for free information from the Stem Cell Research Foundation. That's 1-877-842-3442.
Following the tragic events of September 11th, there have been hundreds of violent attacks against innocent Americans.
Remember what that flag you're waving stands for.
Remember, please stop the hate.
We're stronger when we are united.
Remember what that flag you're waving stands for.
One nation, under God.
Indivisible.
With liberty.
And justice.
For all.
In America, there's either room for everyone, or it's not America. Don't pick the wrong fight.
Let's keep America land of the free.
Stop the hate.
Planning a home renovation? Put this at the top of your to-do list. because after 10 years, none of you are protected against tetanus and another potentially fatal disease, diphtheria. A minor injury, such as a cut or a scrape, can put you at risk for a tetanus infection. And while safety gear offers some protection, an up-to-date vaccination called the TD booster is the best insurance against tetanus. So get the TD booster. If it's been 10, do it again.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
With Mark Levine. My guests are Ginny Diamond, she's a general counsel for the Virginia AFL-CIO, and David Broder, the president of the Service Employees International Union, Local 512. Local means it's like a local union for a certain area of the country?
That's correct. Our members are public employees in Fairfax and Loudoun counties and home care providers across the Commonwealth.
Okay, got it. So we were talking before the break about how difficult it is to form a union today, and you were talking about some of the tactics that corporations are using. And one of the things, David, you said was interesting to me. You said it's illegal, but they do it anyway. Isn't the National Labor Relations Board supposed to enforce these rules, and why aren't they doing it?
You know, there are a lot of reasons, and Ginny could probably speak to this well, too.
That's true. That's the lawyer. Maybe I should have asked you.
I'll say one thing that's happened is that some members of Congress have kept the NLRB from having all its members from enforcing. They've also organized strongly politically to...
They basically had to end the filibuster to allow the NLRB to be fully staffed, and that just happened a few months ago.
That's exactly right.
But hopefully they're acting now, Ginny?
Well, the problem is really the statute. The statute does not provide penalties for employers who, if they threaten, for example, to close the plant. And if this is found to be an actual violation, the penalty is that they put up a notice eventually that says, sorry, won't do it again.
Really?
Exactly. There are no penalties. And so what...
Can the NLRB at least force everyone preemptively to put up that sign? No. You have to basically violate the law, go through all the legal procedures, and then you have to put up a sign.
The point is that it is not a fair election that takes place in
Why
the
not?
campaign. Well, because of the fact that it's not a democratic election when one side can have access to people 8 hours a day and pound them with threats.
You mentioned the Nissan plant, that Nissan is a company that has unions all over the world except the United States, and yet they told their U.S. employees, if we can't unionize here, as we've done everywhere else, then we have to close down. I assume that the people who were voting union didn't know that they were unionized everywhere else. Is that something that you could inform them? How do you as a union inform people in a plant anyway?
Well, what's happening in Mississippi is very interesting, actually. There's hundreds of workers there in the plant that have formed a committee to organize a union, and they are well aware of the fact that their employer, which is a foreign-owned company, recognizes and works with unions everywhere else. And
so they know that.
They want to have a union that will also work with their company so they can have a voice and a seat at the table. Now, what happened when they were threatened was that members of the community have joined together to support them. So the clergy, the NAACP, student groups have all rallied behind them to say, you know, we support your right to a free election. So what they're asking for is a fair election where they can have equal access and no threats. And when the company agrees to have a fair election, not under the NLRB standard of what's fair, but under what international global labor standards.
Equal access and no threats, meaning that union folks could give their pitch and the company can give their pitch.
It's like any other election. Hear from both sides.
Rather than only hearing from one side in a captive meeting.
That's what they're asking for.
And Nissan's refused that.
Absolutely.
They don't want them to hear both sides. They only hear our side.
They haven't agreed to a fair election, and they basically have continued to oppose any effort by the workers in the United States to exercise the same voice.
So what can you do? You can, I guess, send them mailers, which is expensive.
What we're doing actually is very interesting. We're working with those other unions in those other countries. So the Japanese unions, the Brazilian unions, the British unions have all visited Mississippi and have all expressed their support, and they've gone back, and in Brazil, those union members are demonstrating outside of Nissan dealerships in Brazil.
That may be
in
the
South
only way
Africa,
to get people to actually listen is to demonstrate in front of their plant.
Exactly. Well, because corporations are global, unions are now becoming global. And we're engaged in a lot of solidarity, not only getting support for us in the United States so we can have unions again, but also so we can support workers like those in Bangladesh and workers in Mexico.
That's interesting, because if you raise everybody's wages, then you don't have the race to the bottom.
That's our mission.
Okay. I have a resident humorist that does a piece for me every week right here on the Inside Scoop, and he did his own piece. His name is Will Roberts, kind of like Will Rogers, but his name is Will Roberts, and he did a piece on wages, income inequality, and outsourcing. I want to play it for you, and then have you comment on it. Let's hear what Will Roberts has to say about wages and income inequality.
Folks want our president to get us more jobs. And then I think, now every time I flip on the TV, I always see the same headlines. Jobs at an all-time low. You know, folks want our president to get us more jobs. And then I think to myself, maybe we're looking at things from the wrong angle. See, I don't know if we can get jobs at an all-time high when corporate America is anything but made in America. Also, the jobs that we're giving folks here in America, well, they're paying less. I mean, sometimes we have to get 2 to 3 jobs, which means there's less jobs for the folks looking for jobs. Basic math. Now, I don't know if you folks know this, but there's a little bit of an uprising with fast food workers to get paid more. But some of our fast food big boys have tried to come up with a solution, a budget. I don't know why, but it seems to me that this budget brainstorm was created by a bunch of bigwigs in a breakout session, probably here, after playing a lot of this and spending a lot of this. I mean, $0 for heating? It's cold out there. To top it all off, when this budget plan doesn't work on paper, corporate assistant tells their workers to go to the federal government. You know, plans, food stamps. Isn't that socialism? I say we need to band together to help these low-paid workers get a raise. And then they can continue to make those 20 burgers we get for 99 cents. Hey, by the way, supersize it. Oh yeah, and meet me here. I'm Will Roberts, and this is, made of plastic. Made in China. This is your weekly telegram. I give up. Whew.
Thank you, Will Roberts, for that piece. So you saw the piece, and one of the things he refers to humorously, but it's actually really not that funny, is that fast food workers are protesting all across the country, and we've seen them go to McDonald's, and so McDonald's execs decided, well, you can, on your minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, you can live, and they gave them a nice little spreadsheet and all. You even get, I guess, $50 a year or so for fun, but no heat. You don't get any heat. So, you know, maybe for Miami that works, less working for Virginia or the rest of the country. I mean, I guess, did they realize how silly that is? Do people have sympathy for fast food workers? Or how I mean, other than raising the minimum wage, is that the only way we can help them? Who wants to comment? Go ahead, David.
I'll say that's a first step, but we've got a lot more we need to do. As you mentioned, a fast food worker making $7.25 an hour, even if you're working full time, that's $15,000 a year. That's $7,000 less than the federal poverty line for a family of 4. Can you imagine raising a family on $15,000 a year? I mean, essentially what these corporations are asking us as taxpayers to do is to subsidize their payroll. They're asking us to pay health care. They're asking for us to pay
benefits. And that's what happens. That's what's
benefits.
Interesting. When Walmart comes in, studies have shown that because they don't pay their workers health care, because they don't pay them decent wages, it actually causes taxpayer welfare receipts to go up. Because more people come in that frankly need more public assistance. It actually harms the taxpayer when Walmart comes in. A little counterintuitive.
And you know, the fast food workers have 2 demands, not only for a raise, but they also want the right to have a union. If they did have a union, then just as the unions created the middle class back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, then we could unionize in the service sector. There's absolutely no reason why unions belong in manufacturing, but not in service. Now, when people at Walmart tried to organize a union, twice they voted to have a union and Walmart closed the stores. And the same thing happened in Texas when the meat cutters tried to organize a union. They closed the department. So what we really need, we do need an increase in the minimum wage. It hasn't kept pace with inflation. But we also need to give low-wage workers and all workers the right to have a seat at the table, a voice on the job, and to have unions so that we can restore a middle-class economy.
Now, to be fair, the Waltons are each worth only about $100 billion. And for them to actually pay the workers a fair wage might just be 0.01% of their income. They could have 103 yachts, but maybe not 104 yachts. What they've shown is that if they shut down the stores, sure, it harms the people who want the stores, and sure, it harms the workers, and it may even harm Walmart's bottom line, but at least they can show them, in much the way the king would show the feudal serfs and slaves, who's boss. So I guess my question for you is, with all the sympathy clearly they're engendering, I mean, Ebenezer Scrooge was obviously the sympathetic character in A Christmas Carol. It was all about Screw Tiny Tim. Why should that kid walk? Ebenezer Scrooge needs a new gold piece. This is the argument, and yet they're winning. So try to help me understand the public perception of why people are turning out to support Ebenezer Scrooge at the polls rather than Tiny Tim.
Well, I think that's not necessarily the case that they're winning at the polls. What we just saw in Virginia this past November was, I think,
had strong labor support.
Yep, and a strong victory for folks, for politicians getting back to focusing on building good quality jobs.
So you see the trend politically going back towards allowing unions to form?
I think there's something happening here where people are looking at the economy and seeing, just as they did in the 30s, that something has to change. The truth is, it's not just about fast food employees. 7 of the fastest 10 growing professions average less than $30,000 a year. And it's fast food, it's home care providers, it's adjunct professors. This is not about skilled work.
I go on CNBC, I can't tell you how many times. I was on Larry Kudlow's show just a month ago. And he was, of course, arguing against an increase in the minimum wage. And his statement, which I believe to be false, is that, you know, it's only teenagers. It's after school jobs. They're the only ones who work at McDonald's. There's no one over 20 that works at McDonald's. There's no one over 20 that earns the minimum wage. What are the correct statistics
Actually,
about that?
about 75% of the workforce are adults. They're not teenagers at all, and the majority of them are women. And many of them are heads of households, and many of them have more than one job that they're trying to make a
So
living
they are
at.
supporting their family, or attempting to, on the minimum wage.
Absolutely. And you know, the income gap now brings us right back to the 1920s that we were talking about at the beginning of the show. The top 1% controls 40% of the nation's wealth, and the top 10% controls 80% of the nation's wealth. So clearly, any pendulum that anyone believed in has swung so far.
And I saw a statistic that the top 30% control 99% of the nation's wealth, which means that basically for 2/3 of Americans own basically nothing. They're living hand to mouth.
And it's no coincidence that income inequality tracks directly with the decline of the American labor movement.
President Obama gave a recent speech about income inequality, about the American dream. I want to know if the American dream is dead or dying, how it compares with other countries in terms of being able to rise up from poverty, and what we can do about it. So those are the questions when we come back. Again, you can dial in if you want to, 571-749-1166. This is Mark Levine, right back after this.
She's had more than a dozen fractures. And in the next few years, she faces 2 major surgeries to strengthen her fragile bones. She's only 10 years old. Most people don't worry about fragile bones until late in life. For those with osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bones are a concern throughout their lifetime. Find out how you can strengthen this child's future.
Diabetes is a killer. After I was diagnosed, I didn't feel sick, so I didn't listen to my doctor. Then it struck. I had a heart attack, then a stroke, and I was only 49.
Most people with diabetes also have high blood pressure and cholesterol, which can cause severe heart damage. In fact, 2 out of 3 people with diabetes die from heart disease or stroke.
Don't let diabetes destroy your life.
Call for your free diabetes survival guide. Choose to live.
again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. My guests are David Broder, the president of Local 512 of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, and Virginia Diamond, the general counsel for Virginia AFL-CIO, and also a special assistant to the United Auto Workers, which is why you're so informed about Nissan. I want to ask you about income inequality. We started touching on it before the break. President Obama delivered a major speech on it. And you mentioned, Ginny, it's getting worse, that we haven't had this much income inequality since the 1920s, since before the Depression.
That's right, and there's a lot of policy discussion now recently about the problem, and people weighing in on the education system and on the tax system. Now, but personally, I think that if the problem is that incomes of most Americans are too low, then I believe that the solution is to pay people more. So I'm not a Nobel Prize winning economist, but I think if you pay people more, then that will address the problem. The problem is that CEOs who are now earning 400 times what their average
hundreds of millions of dollars, and they don't even have to succeed. They can run their company to the ground, and they still make hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, and they earn more in an hour than workers earn in a month.
Year,
so
sometimes.
it's really obscene. And I think that to expect that this is going to change without something happening, at the grassroots in terms of organizing more unions and people coming together to have a voice on the job and to change that. That's how it happened in the 30s and 40s, and I don't think that there's a better anti-poverty measure around than the labor movement.
Okay, but David, you know the argument. You heard it from Joe the plumber back in 2008. This is redistribution of wealth. If we take a guy who's earning only $500 million a year, and we take it so he's making only $499 million a year, and we spread that million around so that his workers actually get out of poverty, that's redistribution of wealth. That's socialism. That's evil. That's wrong. And clearly there are people who believe this, and not just rich people. Okay, I get why Forbes believes this. I go on CNBC, with all due respect to my friend Larry Kudlow, I understand where he's coming from. What I don't understand, though, is poor people, middle-class people. I don't think Joe the plumber was very wealthy. He may not have been that smart, but he wasn't very wealthy. Why are the middle class buying into this? You were telling me about, you went down and, was it Danville, Virginia, where they thought you were a union thug?
I walked into a room in Danville, Virginia, and a woman looked at me and said, truly disappointed, so you're the union thug?
What did they expect?
Someone, I
Broader
think, much taller, breathing fire. And I like to think that that's a funny story, but the truth is it shows that there's a certain perception about the labor movement.
Why is that? Where does that perception come from?
That perception comes from decades-long attack, a really coordinated effort.
Corporations,
from
Republican
corporations
Party,
teaming up with Republicans, with Tea Party extremists, with Ronald Reagan, to denigrate working men and women and to create, to other the labor movement and say it's something other than simply working men and women standing up for a fair day's pay for a fair day's work.
Okay, again, I understand why the multimillionaire opposes unions, right? Because, like I said, maybe he can't buy his 104th yacht, only 103. I get that. I don't like it, but I get it. Why do middle class and sometimes even working class people buy into this? Because they're afraid for their jobs?
I got to push back on that a little bit.
Okay.
Because in my experience, when people have a true choice about whether to have a union in their workplace, they support it. For example, down in Roanoke, at a plant called Metalsa, where the employer didn't threaten people, it was overwhelmingly a vote for the union. The same thing happened down at IKEA down in Southwest Virginia in Danville.
So people are scared, is what you're saying.
That's the whole point, is that people do want to have a voice on the job. They'd like to have their own representation and organization, but they're scared because they know that their employer is threatening them and intimidating them that they might lose their job. They do not want to lose their job because they have families to support.
So what about all this Tea Party rhetoric? I mean, what about Joe the plumber? And I don't want to give him more. He's already had his 15 seconds of fame. They've worn out. But what about this idea? It's not just wealthy people that vote for the Republican Party. Who are these people? And how are unions reaching out to them?
I'd say our members span the ideological spectrum. Our members are Republicans, Independents, Democrats, they are progressives, and they are Tea Party. Because at the end of the day, whatever party you belong to or vote for, I think all Americans believe that they should have a voice on the job and that they should make enough money to provide for their family. And so we've got to make sure, frankly, that Democrats aren't taking labor for granted and that Republicans stop attacking their own base, which are union members.
One of the things that Republicans do in states all across the United States is they have this, and I hate the name, but they're very good with all that those consultants around there. They call it right-to-work laws. And these laws basically say, correct me if I'm wrong, that if you don't want to pay your union dues, you don't have to. And that means that basically no union dues get paid. It's kind of like making taxes voluntary. Yeah, I want to have a government, but you pay taxes. No, you pay taxes. I want to have a union, but I don't want to pay my union dues, which kills unions. Is that, did I describe it right? And what are we doing about these laws?
Well, right-to-work laws are a bit overstated when people say that you can't have a union in a right-to-work state. That's not true. And in fact, in Virginia, which is a right-to-work state, we have very strong unions where 95% and more people voluntarily join the union. So really all the right-to-work laws are attempts to weaken unions, because what they say to unions is, yes, you have to represent every single person in that facility, but those people do not have to pay for that representation. So
that's, you get a free rider problem. You say, yeah, I want the union to bargain for my lower wages, but I want him to pay for it.
That's exactly right. Right to work no more protects your right to work than President Bush's Clear Skies initiative protected the environment. And the sad truth underneath this is that in right-to-work states like Virginia, working families make less money, they have worse health care, they're more likely to be reliant on public assistance, and the really disturbing part is they're more likely to be injured or even killed on the job.
So basically, right to work weakens unions, and in states with weakened unions, you find worse safety conditions, lower wages, and things like that.
To the tune of $1,500 less per working family, which also means less money in the economy and less money for folks to go out and shop and support their local businesses.
So worry about half and half states, right to work, not right to work. Is that about right? About 25, more or less. But Virginia is one of those. So now we've got a new governor, Democratic governor, Terry McAuliffe. Not clear where the Senate's going to be, but we might just eke out a Democratic Senate. But the General Assembly, the Republicans vastly control that in Virginia. What labor legislation can get through and actually become law in Virginia, Jenny?
Well, the things that we're hoping to achieve, one of them involves the payment of wages. So in Virginia, we want to raise the minimum wage. Yes, it's important, and there is a bill to raise it from $7.25 to $8.50, which is still far short of where it should be with inflation. But in Virginia, there's a law called the Payment of Wage Act, which says that people who work must be paid. However,
seems obvious.
Yes, but under the McDonnell administration, the enforcement mechanism at the Labor Department was abolished. So although there's a rule that says you must be paid, there was no right to go to court to enforce that rule. So one of our goals.
What? Now, I mean, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a Virginia lawyer, to be fair. But if someone renders a service and is not paid for it, they can go to court and they can get their money. Now, it probably costs them a fortune. They need lawyers, and people or factory workers don't have people like you necessarily representing them. I get, but how was there no enforcement? They just.
What happened was that the law is set up so that you would file a complaint with the Department of Labor, and the enforcement people would then investigate and issue an order.
I guess.
And that entire division was abolished. So what the Virginia AFL-CIO wants to do is to restore that division and also provide that there's a private right of action for workers to go to court and to get
And that's something Governor like McAuliffe can do on his own. He doesn't need the legislature to do that.
Well, it's a budget issue.
Oh, so he does need the legislature.
Yes.
So what can Governor McAuliffe do? I mean, he ran on a very pro-labor campaign. What can he do without the legislature, without the General Assembly?
Well, another thing that we would like him to do is to crack down on payroll fraud. And that's a situation where workers are, in many cases, not treated as workers legally. They're called independent contractors, even though they're really workers. So it's very prevalent in the construction
So they don't pay their
industry.
Social Security benefits and Medicare?
They don't do any
like that.
payroll withholding. They don't have workers' comp insurance. They don't pay into the unemployment insurance. And there's many little laws.
So that's something the governor can do by himself, and you expect him to do?
Exactly.
Okay, but David, let's face it, the House of Delegates, it's something like 2/3 Republicans. It's extremely Republican, even after the most recent election. There's a limit to what Terry McAuliffe can do. What can you do? What can unions do? Do we have to wait till 2015 to encourage? Are there labor supporters, Republicans, in the House of Delegates in Virginia?
I think one of the most important things that can be done this session that's pro-labor, that's pro-business, is enacting Medicaid expansion. And if this election was a referendum on anything, it was on Medicaid expansion. We can create 30,000 new jobs in the healthcare industry. We can provide affordable healthcare for up to 400,000 low-income Virginians, the majority of whom work but don't have health insurance through their jobs.
I'm really glad you brought that up because it's not brought up enough. And frankly, a lot of people don't understand what it is. So for those of you that don't know, basically under the Affordable Care Act, the government will pay 100% of all health costs of all poor people in America. Pretty good deal for the states. Now, it's true that after about 10 years, it goes down to only 90%. But for 10% of the cost, all poor people in all states can be paid. That was the law, and the Supreme Court ruled in a law that I've read the full opinion, and it makes zero legal sense, I have to say. It does not rely on precedent at all, but basically says, states, if you don't want this free money to provide for your poor people, the law said if you don't want it, you can just get rid of all of Medicaid. They said you can keep Medicaid the way it was because, well, there was no logic in the opinion. But the heart of the opinion means is that governors can either take the money on the table for their poor people or refuse it. And about half the states, notably our bordering state, Maryland, every poor person in Maryland who wants health care gets it. Not just blue states, Kentucky, generally a red state. Every poor person in Kentucky who wants medical care gets it at no cost to the Kentucky taxpayer. It's amazing. I had a guy from Kentucky on my show, so happy about it. But in half the states, the ones with Republican governors, they've said, you know what, we want our poor people to suffer. Yeah, it doesn't cost us anything. Yeah, it doesn't cost our states anything. Yeah, in fact, Virginia taxpayers are currently subsidizing Maryland taxpayers, paying for their poor people. But because we believe that poor people are evil or wrong, we want them to suffer. We believe that children shouldn't get care. We believe that adults who have curable diseases should keep those diseases. It's basically because in half the states, they hate poor people. It's an extreme position, and I know this sounds extreme, but if you had a chance to heal a child with a disease for free, with no money out of your pocket, wouldn't cost you a thing. All you have to do is say yes, and bingo, every child in your state had health care. Would you say yes, or would you say no? 26 governors have said no, and Governor McDonnell of Virginia, just like half the states, the Republican governors, said no. Terry McAuliffe has promised to say yes, but he needs the legislature too, doesn't he?
And I think he does, and it's worth noting that we are talking about the working poor. These are folks who are working hard every day. And again, we're in this problem because their employers have decided to ask us, the taxpayers, to pay for their health care as opposed to them providing health care.
And the irony is it's already paid for. It's already budgeted. Yep. It's money sitting on the table that unless you hate poor people for some reason, it just doesn't make any sense to withhold it. 571-749-1166, your last chance to call in if you wish. This is Mark Levine, back after this.
Art, a universal language, an expression of culture, of self. And now, thanks to Empowered Women International, a way for emerging and established immigrant and refugee artists and artisans to find hope to earn a living while enriching the lives of all of us. Empowered Women International, making a better America every day. For more information on Empowered Women International's educational programs or to make a tax-free donation, contact cfripp@aol.com.
You'd think it would be easy to tell which kids have trouble with their eyesight. But that's not always the case. Even though 1 in 4 children may have a vision problem, eye doctors tell us the symptoms aren't always so obvious. We do know that 80% of all childhood learning is visual. And without good vision, kids can have trouble learning to read and may fall behind in school. For clues on how to spot the real-life signs of childhood vision problems and what parents can do, visit Check Yearly.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Mark Levine. Happy New Year to everyone. We are talking about labor issues, income inequality, wage issues with David Broder, president of the Service Employees International Union, Local 512, and Ginny Diamond. She's the general counsel for the entire Virginia AFL-CIO and a special assistant to the United Auto Workers. So you're quite busy. I guess you get to relax a little bit this time of year. At least I hope so. I want to just finish what we were talking about with regard to the fact that half the states in the United States, including Virginia, have said we're not going to cover poor people in our state even though it doesn't cost us a dime, which I find extraordinary. I understand, I don't like it, but I understand Republicans saying we won't spend a dime on poor people. Ebenezer Scrooge, I'm not going to give up one gold piece. I'm not going to give up my fingernails to help Tiny Tim. But when it costs you nothing, I don't even understand their argument. The only argument I've heard is, look, if poor people get health care, then they're going to want to keep getting health care. And that's something that we don't want to happen because it'll make President Obama look good and we want to win elections. I have heard people say that to me, though usually they tell it to me off camera. What is the argument against it?
Mark, in Virginia, we usually are able to work out these things, and I do believe that we will have Medicaid expansion because
you're awfully optimistic.
Because it makes sense.
It's clearly logical. You told me the Chamber of Commerce supports it. They're not usually your allies.
And hospitals, and why would we want to give up $5 million a day from the federal government? And as David said, most of these are working people.
$5 million a day. The other thing to remember is that you pay a lot of money for people getting emergency care in the hospitals because they can't get it anywhere else. They have to use the emergency rooms. So when you have a real emergency, there are people there with normal medical conditions, understanding they can only get help in the emergency room. All that money would be saved as well. So it's a win-win. I don't understand.
It's actually going to cost us more money when we opt not to expand Medicaid.
Right. You have to pay money to really harm the poor.
In Virginia, there's a lot of emphasis on being number one for business. And I think now the approach has to be, we also want to be number one for working families so that we have a balance. And that's the way that Virginia will really thrive.
How soon can this happen? Medicaid expansion, Ms. Optimist here. How soon can this happen?
Well, let's do it this session.
Which is in what, 3 months?
It's 3 days. So
3 days.
It starts January 8th.
And ends?
The end of February.
End of February. So this can be done in the next 2 months.
Or early March.
And if people want it done, they just call their local assemblyman or member of the House Delegates, member of Senate.
Absolutely.
And let them know. And that's really important because here's the thing. It helps, obviously it helps you if you're poor, but it also helps you if you're middle class and you're just a Virginia taxpayer because you end up paying less taxes because, as you point out, David, it costs more to harm the poor, it costs more, you get to pay for emergency rooms, and you might not want to subsidize the people in Maryland and Delaware. You might just want the money that you're paying in your taxes anyway to come here.
And it'll
home.
create a lot of jobs too, and that's what we all want. We all want good jobs.
I do want to ask you, though, about the criticism that's often levied against unions. Whenever I mention unions, I usually get one of two reactions. I either get, of course, unions, we love weekends, union creation, we love time and a half, we understand that our jobs are stronger and our wages are higher because of unions. That's about half the people I talk to. The other half of people say, oh, unions. You know what they're about? They're about protecting the incompetent worker. There's this teacher, and she's terrible, and we can't get her fired because of her union. Or there's this government worker, and he's awful, and the union protects him. I want you to really address that criticism because I do hear it a lot.
I think that's one of the right wing's favorite attacks on working people. And Mark, you might be shocked to learn it's completely untrue.
It's completely bogus.
It's completely bogus.
So you could still fire an incompetent worker.
Absolutely. And what we believe in, what Americans believe deeply in, is fairness. We believe that everybody deserves a fair hearing.
You get a hearing.
You get a hearing.
Basically, you say, hey, don't just fire me, tell me what I did wrong.
Your boss should not be able to...
And if your boss can't specify what you did wrong, the union will help you keep your job. But if the boss says you came in late every day and you filed these things wrong and you broke several things and you were drunk on the job, you can still fire somebody.
Well, exactly, and of course it's a prerogative of management to make those decisions, but it shouldn't be based on favoritism. It should be based on actual workplace performance.
So the only thing union does is require basically a hearing.
Due process. So the people who are disciplined or terminated for no reason at all will have some recourse, someone to back them up. And I think there are other misconceptions about unions too that we'd love to clear up. While we're here.
Please do.
One of them is that I think that one reason why some people don't think unions are a great thing, other than the fact that we were really good 70 years ago. I don't think people really fully understand that unions exist not just to help their members, but to advocate for all working people.
Yeah, everyone's wages go up. If unionized workers are getting a certain wage, then even non-unionized workers do better. It's a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom.
Well, that used to be more the case. Now, when you have a smaller percentage of the workforce unionized, then the key is, and this is where unions have really changed, and we are no longer our grandfathers' unions, is that we're really focusing on organizing more people, on representing more people, on finding non-traditional ways to represent people. Because it's not enough to say, if we bring up our wages, we union members, then everyone will benefit. We really need to explicitly and directly work for the benefit of all working people, and that's what we're doing.
What's a non-traditional union thing today? What's new? What's the change from the 70s?
Well, for example, reaching out to immigrant workers, whether they're day laborers or whether they're documented or undocumented, bringing them into the labor movement, helping support them, fighting for immigration reform. It's a really big thing, and in Virginia, we're supporting the right of dreamers, or people who have had kids who are
grew up in America, lived their whole lives here.
Let them pay in-state tuition. They've gone to school here, they've grown up here, and bring them into our society, integrate them, and treat them with respect.
David, the SEIU, is that mostly public sector workers?
It's public sector, it's private sector,
about half
healthcare.
And half, or more public than private?
Much like the American labor movement, it is more public sector than private sector.
Well, here's my question, because in Wisconsin there was a huge deal over Scott Walker basically attacking the public sector unions. He was the governor, it still is the governor of Wisconsin. They had a recall movement that just barely failed, but he attacked public sector unions but kept private sector unions. And I've heard the argument, and they've come at me on CNBC with this argument, that, okay, private sector unions, that's fine, we understand people need, labor needs a seat at the table against big business and corporations, but the public sector, that's all of us, that's taxpayers, that's the government. Why do we need public sector unions?
Because your family, my family, needs to make a living wage and have health care and a secure retirement regardless of where we work. My mother is a teacher. I can't imagine that she deserves good jobs and health care any less than somebody who works for a private company. It's never made much sense to me.
And it's also really important to point out that public sector unions are very dedicated to providing good service. Just as in the private sector, unions want to improve quality and are invested in the success of their employers. In the public sector, unions are there to advocate for, whether it's firefighters or police or teachers, to advocate for the services that they provide so they can do the work that they believe in.
And one of the things that unions do that I find very interesting, it's not wages, it's not working conditions, but it's simply a way to tell management when things are going wrong. There are good managers out there are good businesses out there. I think of the small mom and pop stores where you go in and you say what's going well, what's not working, the cash register should be here or not there, and there shouldn't be a line. But some of the bigger corporations, they don't have that voice. If the president or CEO of Nissan goes down to a guy on the factory floor and says, how's the assembly line working, she may be really afraid to tell him the truth about how the assembly line keeps halting and so forth, because she's afraid she's going to lose her job. The unions can be her voice.
That's exactly right. For quality, for efficiency, for safety, so people are not afraid to speak. And when you refer back to Nissan again, in certain Nissan plants, actually in the United States, majority of those production workers don't even work directly for Nissan. They're actually temp workers from agencies.
And they do that so they don't have to pay them health care?
They do that so they can pay, less benefits, and so then they can say they never laid anybody off because they never hired them in the first place.
I see. Now, Walmart is doing commercials. I keep seeing them. I don't know, I feel bad for the actors, or maybe they really are workers. I have no idea, but they're like, Walmart's been good to me. They gave me health care. And I'm thinking, what, they let you see a doctor once every 10 years? What is the truth here? Because Walmart has they're spending a lot of money on these ads saying, we're good employers. What's the real truth, David?
I think the real truth is that money would be better spent making sure that their employees have health care and have good jobs. But the truth of it too is we often talk about Walmart. It's not just Walmart. This is an economy-wide problem, whether it's McDonald's or Burger King, or again, higher education facilities that are paying their adjunct professors less than a living wage. We really have to demand that anyone who works full-time is not going to live in poverty. And I think that is regardless of what sector of the economy you work in.
The irony is that when people talk about income inequality in America, I get all these conservatives say, yeah, welfare queens. I guess they're going back to Ronald Reagan, which was 30 years ago, talking about this mythical, it was never true, homeless person that collects, alms on the street and then drives home in a limousine. That didn't exist. But there are people that have this idea that poor people aren't trying, that you're just sitting there collecting their welfare checks and popping out babies. I mean, that's what people say. I'm saying it publicly. It may sound offensive to some people, but a lot of people have said this to me privately. What's the truth about the poor? How many are working? How many are trying to work? How many are welfare queens?
The truth is that that poverty exists among the working poor, that people are not earning a living wage. People are working 2 jobs or more. And the fact is that the minimum wage hasn't kept up with inflation, and we cannot have a middle-class democracy unless we give people the right to organize unions. That's what gave us the middle class in the first place. So there's never been a democratic society that didn't have strong unions. And I don't think that the American
That's true in Europe, that's true in Japan, that's true in Australia, it's true in Canada.
Exactly. There's never been a democracy because not only for a voice in the workplace, but a voice in society at large, and a voice in politics, a voice in civil society. If you don't have organizations for workers, then you really do have an oligopoly.
I read in the Washington Post that the minimum wage in 1960s, if it were brought up to today's standards, would be well over $10 an hour. Is that the kind of rate that you're looking to see, David, that you're advocating for?
I think that's a good first step, but we've got to go beyond. I think we've got to ask, what is the salary that will make sure that folks, kids will have a better life than they have? What will be the salaries that will get our economy moving again? That's exactly right.
One of the things President Obama pointed out was if you're born in the top 20%, then there's an 80 to 90% shot that you'll stay in the top 20%. This isn't by merit, this is just you're lucky enough to be born into the right families. But if you're born in the lowest 20%, there's only a 5% chance that you're going to rise to the very top. The American dream used to exist. Is it dying now? We only got a few seconds left. What can we do more than anything to help the American dream?
In my view, the way to rebuild the middle class is to support the people's right to form unions so they can advocate, so they can be checks and balances
unions
against
are the path
corporate power.
To the American dream.
Exactly.
The path to the middle class. The path to the middle class. Jenny, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. David, you as well, for sharing this. This is something that, look, 2013 hasn't been the greatest year for poor middle class working people in America, but let's hope for a better 2014 with the good work that both of you are doing. I want to thank you both very much.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year.
Let's go, but Happy New Year. Happy New Year to you as well. Keep watching the Inside Scoop. We are on every Monday at this station, Channel 10, also on the web at marklevinetalk.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at marklevinetalk, and I encourage you to do so.